The first sip of coffee was always the best part of Captain Robert Mitchell's morning routine. He stood in the break room of Andrews Air Force Base, watching the October sun paint the runway in shades of gold and amber. Steam curled from his mug, carrying the rich aroma of the dark roast he'd learned to love during his tour in Germany. Outside the window, a pair of F-15 Eagles sat ready on the tarmac, their gray bodies gleaming like sleeping predators. Mitchell had logged 2,847 flight hours in those magnificent machines. Today would add a few more routine patrol hours to that number, or so he thought. The clock on the wall read 5:47 hours. October 15, 1983. A Thursday. Mitchell took another sip, savoring the moment of peace before the day's briefings began. At 42 years old, with 15 years of service and 3 commendations for valor, he'd earned the right to enjoy his coffee in silence. His dark hair was starting to show threads of silver at the temples, and the lines around his eyes had deepened from squinting into countless sunrises at 30,000 feet. But his hands remained steady, his reflexes sharp, and his reputation as one of the Air Force's most reliable interceptor pilots was unshakable. The alarm shattered everything. A piercing klaxon tore through the building, the sound that every pilot both dreaded and lived for. Mitchell's coffee mug hit the counter before his conscious mind registered movement. His feet were already carrying him toward the ready room as voices erupted over the base intercom. Scramble, scramble, scramble. All alert aircraft. Immediate launch. Unknown aircraft approaching restricted airspace. The hallway became a river of running bodies. Pilots emerged from doorways, pulling on flight suits mid-stride. Mitchell's weapons systems officer, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, appeared beside him, her black hair still wet from a shower, her eyes already hard with focus. Chen was 28, brilliant, and had a gift for reading radar screens that bordered on supernatural. In the 18 months they'd flown together, Mitchell had learned to trust her instincts completely. "What have we got?" Mitchell barked as they burst into the ready room. The duty officer, Major Frank Dawson, was already pointing at a large radar display that dominated one wall. His face was pale, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Unidentified aircraft, bearing 270, speed 340 knots, altitude 25,000 feet, heading straight for DC restricted airspace. His finger traced a red dot moving across the screen like a threatening promise. Mitchell studied the trajectory. His pilot's brain automatically calculated intercept angles, fuel consumption, time to target. "Have we established radio contact?" "Negative." Dawson's voice was tight. "We've tried every civilian and military frequency. Nothing. Not even a transponder signal. It's like whoever's flying that thing doesn't want to be identified or doesn't care." Chen leaned over the display, her fingers dancing across the controls to zoom in on the radar return. "This isn't right," she muttered. "Look at this." She highlighted the track history. The blip appeared, disappeared, then reappeared in slightly different positions. The altitudes fluctuating between 23 and 26,000 feet. And see these course corrections. Too erratic for autopilot, too deliberate for mechanical failure. Mitchell felt his jaw tighten. 20 years of Cold War tension had taught him that when something didn't make sense, it usually meant trouble. The Soviet Union had been increasingly aggressive with reconnaissance flights, testing American response times and defensive capabilities. Just last month, a Korean Airlines flight had been shot down after straying into Soviet airspace. The world was a powder keg, and an unidentified aircraft heading for Washington, D.C., was the kind of spark that could ignite catastrophe. "ETA to restricted airspace?" Mitchell asked, already knowing he wouldn't like the answer. 12 minutes, Dawson replied. "Maybe less if he increases speed. The Pentagon's on high alert. Secret Service is moving the president to a secure location. Bob, they're evacuating the White House." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Mitchell had flown combat missions, had gone head-to-head with MiGs over hostile territory, had landed a crippled F-15 with one engine and half his hydraulics gone. But the thought of an unknown aircraft, potentially hostile, potentially carrying God knew what, bearing down on the nation's capital made his blood turn to ice water. "We're up," he said simply, his voice cutting through the chaos in the room. Chen nodded, already moving toward their aircraft. They drilled this scenario 100 times. Now it was real. The sprint across the tarmac felt like running through honey. Every second stretched, elastic and surreal. Mitchell's flight suit clung to his body, still warm from the storage locker. His helmet felt heavier than usual as he climbed the ladder to his F-15's cockpit. Below him, ground crew members worked with choreographed precision, checking weapons systems, fuel lines, and engine intakes. "All systems green," Chen's voice crackled in his helmet as she settled into the rear seat, her hands already flying over the weapons system's controls. Mitchell's fingers moved through the startup sequence with practiced grace, each switch flip a small prayer for success. The twin Pratt & Whitney engines roared to life with a sound that never failed to make his heart race, a deep, powerful thunder that he felt in his chest as much as heard with his ears. The F-15 was a weapon, sleek and deadly, capable of Mach 2.5 and carrying enough missiles to take down an entire squadron. But it was also a guardian, a shield, the thin gray line between safety and disaster. "Tower, this is Eagle 427, requesting immediate takeoff clearance," Mitchell radioed, already releasing the brakes and feeling the aircraft strain forward like a hunting dog catching a scent. "Eagle 427, you are cleared for immediate departure. Godspeed, Captain." The runway stretched before him, a ribbon of concrete pointing toward the brightening sky. Mitchell pushed the throttles forward, feeling the massive engines respond instantly. The acceleration pressed him back into his seat as the world outside became a blur. At 150 knots, he pulled back on the stick, and the F-15 leaped into the air as if it had been desperate to fly. The ground fell away, and suddenly they were climbing through 5,000 feet, then 10,000, the altimeter spinning like a clock racing toward midnight. Chen's voice was calm in his ear, reading off coordinates and calculations, but Mitchell could hear the tension underneath. They both knew what was at stake. "Target bearing 265, range 42 miles and closing," Chen reported. "Bob, I'm picking up something weird on the radar signature. It's too small for a commercial jet but too fast for a prop plane. I'm thinking citation, maybe a Lear, some kind of business jet." Mitchell's hands tightened on the stick. A business jet flying dark heading for Washington, refusing all radio contact. The possibilities raced through his mind, none of them good. Hijacking, defection, suicide mission, or maybe just a lost pilot with a radio malfunction. But Mitchell's instincts, honed by thousands of hours in the cockpit, told him this was something else entirely. "Time to intercept. 4 minutes at current speed, 3 if you push it." Mitchell pushed it. The F-15 surged forward, breaking through wispy clouds, the sky around them turning from gold to brilliant blue. Somewhere ahead in that perfect autumn morning, an aircraft with no name and no voice was racing toward the heart of American power. And Captain Robert Mitchell was the only thing standing in its way. The radar blip became reality at 25,000 feet. Mitchell spotted it first, a white streak against the deep blue sky, sunlight glinting off its polished fuselage. "Visual contact," he reported, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. 12 o'clock level, approximately 2 miles. He eased the F-15 closer, reducing throttle to match the aircraft's speed. The distance closed rapidly, 1 mile, half a mile, a quarter mile. Details emerged from the bright speck, the distinctive T-tail of a business jet, the sleek nose cone, twin engines mounted on the rear fuselage. Chen's assessment had been correct. It was a Cessna Citation II, a luxury aircraft favored by corporate executives and wealthy private owners. 8 seats transcontinental range, price tag north of $2 million. But this citation was flying like it was being piloted by a drunk. Jesus, Chen breathed in his ear, look at that wing wobble. Mitchell watched as the aircraft's wings dipped left, then overcorrected right, the motion suggesting either severe turbulence, which didn't exist in these calm skies, or a pilot who was struggling desperately with the controls. The citation's path wasn't straight, but rather a shallow S-curve, weaving slightly as if the person at the yoke couldn't quite maintain heading. "Command, I have visual on target," Mitchell radioed. "Cessna Citation II, white with blue trim, registration number November 73. He squinted, reading the tail number painted on the vertical stabilizer. "November 73 Charlie Papa. Aircraft is flying erratically. Possible pilot incapacitation or mechanical issue." The response from Major Dawson came back immediately, tight with urgency. "Eagle 427, close to visual range and attempt radio contact. Use all necessary force to prevent entry into restricted airspace. Rules of engagement are authorized." Rules of engagement authorized. The words meant Mitchell had permission to shoot this aircraft out of the sky if it didn't comply. His right hand moved unconsciously to the weapons panel, fingers hovering over the controls that could unleash an AIM-9 Sidewinder missile. One trigger pull, and that beautiful white citation would become a fireball tumbling from the sky. Mitchell swallowed hard and brought his F-15 alongside the citation, close enough to see the rivets in the aluminum skin, close enough to read the warning labels near the fuel ports. This was dangerous flying. The F-15's wake turbulence could flip the smaller aircraft if he wasn't careful, but he needed to see inside that cockpit. The citation's windows were tinted, dark blue and difficult to see through in the bright morning sun. Mitchell adjusted his position, rising slightly to get a better angle. For a moment, the glare defeated him, showing only mirror-like reflections of clouds and sky. Then the citation banked slightly, and the angle changed. What Mitchell saw made his blood run cold. Through the cockpit window, he could make out two figures. The one in the left seat, the captain's seat, was slumped forward against the controls, head down, completely motionless. The figure in the right seat was moving frantically, hands working the yoke, head swiveling between the instrument panel and the windscreen. Even from 50 feet away, Mitchell could see the desperation in those movements, the jerky overcorrections, the way the person kept looking down at the controls as if trying to remember what each one did. "Command, I have eyes on the cockpit," Mitchell reported, his mind racing through possibilities. "Captain appears unconscious or incapacitated. Someone in the co-pilot seat is attempting to fly the aircraft. There. They don't look trained. Movements are amateur." Chen's voice cut in on their internal channel. "Bob, look at the cockpit door, behind the pilots." Mitchell shifted his gaze. Through the tinted glass, he could just barely make out the cabin beyond the cockpit. Was that another person? A shadow moved in the darkness of the passenger area. His imagination conjured terrible scenarios: hijackers, hostages, weapons, bombs. "Unidentified aircraft. This is United States Air Force Fighter 427 off your right wing," Mitchell transmitted on the emergency frequency, his voice carrying the full weight of command. "You are in violation of restricted airspace. Identify immediately and follow my instructions, or you will be fired upon. Acknowledge this transmission." Nothing, just the steady hiss of static. Mitchell tried again, this time on the civilian aviation frequency. "Cessna Citation, November 73 Charlie Papa. This is Air Force Interceptor on your right wing. You must identify yourself immediately. Rock your wings if you can hear this transmission but cannot respond." Still nothing. The citation continued its wavering flight, now less than 7 minutes from the invisible boundary that would put it over downtown Washington, D.C., over the Capitol building, over the White House, over targets that would bring the full force of American military might down upon it. They're not responding, Chen said, unnecessary but giving voice to the mounting tension. Either their radio is dead or they're ignoring us. Or they can't respond, Mitchell added grimly. A medical emergency, heart attack, stroke, decompression sickness, could explain an unconscious pilot and a panicked passenger trying to save the aircraft. But it didn't explain the radio silence. Every aircraft had multiple radios, multiple backups. He moved the F-15 even closer, now just 30 feet from the Citation's wingtip. At this distance, if the other pilot made one wrong move, both aircraft could collide in a tangle of metal and fire. Mitchell could see scratches in the Citation's paint, could read the placard near the emergency exit, could see his own reflection in the cockpit glass. And then, movement. The figure in the co-pilot's seat turned and looked directly at Mitchell. For one frozen heartbeat, their eyes met through 2 layers of curved plexiglass and 50 feet of rushing air. Mitchell saw a young face, male, Latino, eyes wide with what could have been fear or determination or both. The person's mouth was moving, saying something Mitchell couldn't hear, couldn't read on the lips. Then the person's hand reached for something on the center console. Mitchell's finger tensed on the weapon's control. If that hand came up with anything that looked like a weapon or a detonator. The radio exploded with sound. Not words, not yet, just breathing, harsh, ragged, desperate gasping as if someone was drowning in air. The sound of someone pushing past the limits of human endurance. Mitchell heard clicking, fumbling, then the breathing became clearer as whoever it was finally managed to key the microphone properly. "Don't," the voice that came through was young, male, cracking with strain and something that sounded like pain. Don't shoot, please God, don't shoot." The words were barely coherent, rushed together in panic and desperation. In the background, Mitchell could hear alarms blaring, the steady beep 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 of warning systems, the intermittent buzz of something else, maybe a stall warning or fuel indicator. Mitchell's training warred with his instincts. The voice sounded genuinely terrified, but terror could be an act. Hijackers had used fear and sympathy as weapons before. "Identify yourself," Mitchell commanded, his voice hard as steel. "Now." Silence, more of that terrible breathing. Then, "I'm trying. The pilot's unconscious. I don't know how to. This thing keeps dropping." The Citation suddenly dipped, losing 100 feet in seconds. Mitchell watched the nose drop, saw the person in the co-pilot seat yanking back on the yoke, overcorrecting, sending the aircraft into a porpoise motion that threatened to tear it apart. Whoever was flying had barely enough skill to keep it in the air, let alone land it safely. "Listen to me carefully," Mitchell said, forcing calm into his voice despite his hammering heart. "What's your name? Are you the owner of this aircraft?" A pause. The breathing steadied slightly, as if the person was trying to gather courage or make a decision. When the voice came back, it carried an edge that made Mitchell's instincts scream. I can't tell you that. Can't or won't. You've got 30 seconds to identify yourself or I'm authorized to bring you down," Mitchell said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Through his canopy, he could see the person's head drop, shoulders shaking. Was he crying? Praying? The Citation wavered again, crossing into a shallow descent. The altimeter was unwinding. 24,800 feet, 24,600, 24,400. Not a controlled descent, but rather the gradual loss of altitude that came from someone who didn't know how to maintain level flight. Chen's voice crackled urgently. "Bob, 5 minutes to restricted airspace boundary. Command is asking for status." 5 minutes, 300 seconds. Mitchell stared at the white Citation, at the desperate figure fighting the controls, at the unconscious pilot slumped in the left seat. Every instinct told him something was wrong here, something beyond a simple medical emergency or navigation error. But what? The voice came back, stronger now, as if the person had made some kind of decision. "I need you to contact Nellie's Air Force Base. Tell them, A pause heavy with meaning. Tell them Ghost Rider is still alive. The words hit Mitchell like a physical blow. Behind him, he heard Chen's sharp intake of breath. Ghost Rider. That wasn't a civilian call sign. That wasn't a distress code. That was military, classified military. And Mitchell had no idea what it meant, but the fact that this person knew it changed everything. Say again your last transmission, Mitchell demanded, his mind racing. Who is Ghost Rider? But the only answer was the sound of alarms, growing louder now, joined by a new sound, a sputtering cough from one of the Citation's engines. The aircraft was dying, and whoever was inside had just opened a door to questions that might get them all killed. Mitchell's world narrowed to a single point of focus, the white Citation wavering in the sky beside him, and the impossible words that had just come through his radio. Ghost Rider. The name echoed in his mind, carrying weight he couldn't quite place, triggering memories of classified briefings and redacted documents he'd glimpsed in passing. "Command, stand by," Mitchell transmitted, then switched to his internal channel. "Chen, what the hell is Ghost Rider?" Behind him, he could hear the rapid clicking of keys as Chen accessed the F-15's onboard computer, pulling up classified databases that only weapons systems officers with top-secret clearance could reach. "Searching now," she muttered. "Ghost Rider, Ghost Rider. Bob, there are 17 different operations with that code name going back to Vietnam. I need more parameters." The Citation dropped another 200 feet. Through his canopy, Mitchell watched the aircraft shudder, its right engine coughing black smoke. The person at the controls was clearly losing the battle. "Unidentified aircraft, I need more information," Mitchell transmitted, keeping his voice steady. "Ghost Rider is not enough. Give me specifics." The response came between labored breaths, each word sounding like it cost the speaker something precious. "Transport. Flight. 279, Nevada, 3 days ago. Tell them we didn't all die." Mitchell felt the temperature in his cockpit drop 10 degrees. Behind him, Chen had gone completely silent, and silence from Chen was never a good sign. He waited, counting heartbeats, watching the Citation struggle to maintain altitude as one engine continued to fail. "Bob," Chen's voice was barely a whisper, tight with disbelief. Transport Flight 279 was an Air Force cargo flight that went missing 72 hours ago over the Nevada desert. Departed Nelly's Air Force Base on a classified run, lost contact somewhere over the Humboldt Range. Search and rescue spotted the wreckage from the air yesterday morning. "And," Mitchell prompted, though part of him already knew what was coming. "And they declared everyone on board KIA killed in action. 4 crew members. The wreckage was—" "Bob, the official report said the aircraft burned on impact. They identified the bodies through dental records. The memorial service is scheduled for tomorrow at Arlington." The Citation banked left suddenly, a desperate correction as the pilot fought against the dying engine's asymmetric thrust. Mitchell matched the turn instinctively, his hands moving the F-15's controls with the unconscious grace of 15 years' experience. But his mind was reeling. "Are you telling me," Mitchell said slowly, "that whoever's flying that Citation is claiming to be someone who's officially dead?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you." Chen's voice had shifted from disbelief to something harder, more analytical. "Either this is an elaborate hoax or someone screwed up the identification," Mitchell finished. "Or the crash wasn't what it seemed." The radio crackled again, and this time the voice was clearer, stronger, as if the speaker had found some reserve of strength or determination. "My name is Captain James Rodriguez. I was co-pilot of Transport 279. Authentication code Bravo Tango 662 Lima. Serial number 4732985. And sir, I don't have time to convince you I'm real. I've got maybe 3 minutes of fuel left, and I need to get this information to someone who can act on it." Chen was already typing furiously. "Running the authentication code. Bob, Holy Mother of God, the code is valid. It matches Rodriguez's file. James Rodriguez, captain, 29 years old, graduated top of his class from flight school, certified on C-130s and helicopters. Currently, she paused, currently listed as deceased. Mitchell's mind raced through possibilities, each one more disturbing than the last. A hoax would require someone to steal a dead officer's authentication codes. A mistake in identification seemed unlikely with 4 bodies and dental records, which left the most terrifying option, that Captain James Rodriguez had somehow survived a crash that killed his crew and was now flying a stolen civilian aircraft toward Washington, D.C. with information important enough to risk everything. "Rodriguez," Mitchell said, his voice carrying a different tone now, still commanding but edged with something that might have been respect or curiosity. "If you're really who you say you are, tell me something only someone from that flight would know, something not in any report." The Citation's right engine coughed one final time and died completely, the propeller windmilling uselessly in the slipstream. The aircraft yawed hard right. Through his canopy, Mitchell watched Rodriguez fight the controls, using rudder and aileron to compensate for the asymmetric thrust. The corrections were crude but effective, not the polished technique of an experienced pilot, but the desperate improvisation of someone who'd learned just enough to be dangerous. "You were carrying Broken Arrow Package Delta 3, Rodriguez's voice came back, steady now despite the obvious strain. "Classified weapons technology, new guidance systems for tactical nuclear devices. The manifest listed it as electronic components, but I saw the seals, I saw the security protocols." He paused, and when he continued, his voice was raw with emotion. "The crash wasn't an accident. Someone sabotaged our hydraulics. I saw the cut lines myself when I crawled out of the wreckage." Chen's gasp was audible even through the roar of the F-15's engines. "Bob, Broken Arrow protocols are—" "I know what they are," Mitchell cut her off. "Broken Arrow, the military code for a lost, damaged, or stolen nuclear weapon or component. The kind of situation that brought out entire battle groups, that had generals sweating in the Pentagon, that could trigger international incidents or worse." "Command, we have a Broken Arrow situation," Mitchell transmitted, his voice cutting through every other frequency. "Repeat, possible Broken Arrow, patching through to NORAD command immediately." The radio exploded with voices, officers demanding clarification, intelligence personnel asking for verification, someone from the Pentagon Situation Room shouting questions over everyone else. But Mitchell ignored them all, his attention locked on the Citation now limping through the sky on one engine, trailing smoke, losing altitude at an alarming rate. "Rodriguez, what's your fuel status?" Mitchell asked. "Needles on empty. I'm running on fumes and prayers, maybe 2 minutes if I'm lucky." The young captain's voice cracked slightly. "I stole this plane from a ranch 70 miles from the crash site. Old guy named Bill Henderson. Told him I'd bring it back in one piece." A bitter laugh. "I'm not keeping that promise." Mitchell glanced at his navigation display. They were now 4 minutes from restricted airspace, descending through 23,000 feet, the Potomac River visible in the distance like a silver thread cutting through the landscape. Below them, suburban Maryland spread out in neat grids of houses and schools and shopping centers, thousands of people going about their Thursday morning, completely unaware that a drama involving stolen nuclear technology and a ghost pilot was playing out in the sky above them. "There's another survivor," Rodriguez said suddenly, urgency flooding back into his voice. "Lieutenant Marcus Webb. He's still at the crash site with a broken leg, guarding what's left of the package. But the people who sabotaged us, they're coming back. I saw their vehicles moving in yesterday afternoon. Webb's got a sidearm and maybe 24 hours before they find him and finish what they started." Chen was already coordinating with command, providing the crash site coordinates, requesting immediate deployment of rescue and security teams. But Mitchell's focus remained on the dying Citation, on the young captain who'd somehow survived the unsurvivable and was now attempting the impossible. "Rodriguez, listen to me very carefully," Mitchell said, his voice taking on the tone he'd used countless times when talking panicked pilots through emergencies. "I'm going to get you on the ground. Do you trust me?" A pause, then so quietly Mitchell almost missed it. "Do I have a choice, sir?" Despite everything, the potential nuclear crisis, the sabotage, the impossible situation, Mitchell found himself smiling grimly. "No, son, you really don't." The Citation's remaining engine began to sputter. They were out of time. The sputtering of the Citation's last engine sounded like a death rattle even through the radio transmission. Mitchell watched the smoke trail thicken, changing from gray to black, the telltale sign of an engine eating itself from the inside. They were at 21,000 feet now, dropping at 600 feet per minute, and every instinct Mitchell had developed over 15 years of flying screamed that this aircraft would never make a controlled landing. "Rodriguez, shut down that engine before it catches fire," Mitchell commanded. "Cut the fuel, pull the mixture to idle cutoff. Do it now." Which one? There are so many switches." The panic was creeping back into Rodriguez's voice, the brief moment of steadiness evaporating as the reality of his situation closed in. Mitchell cursed under his breath. Rodriguez had said his flight training was in helicopters, and even that was probably basic. A Cessna Citation's cockpit was a maze of switches, gauges, and controls to someone unfamiliar with business jets. "Red handles above your head, right side. Pull them down." Through his canopy, Mitchell watched the smoke trail sputter and die as Rodriguez found the correct controls. The Citation was now a glider, both engines silent, descending through the crystalline October sky with nothing but gravity and momentum keeping it aloft. The sudden silence must have been terrifying for the young captain. No engine noise to mask the whistle of wind over the wings, no vibration to suggest the aircraft was still functioning. Just the eerie quiet of a $20 million machine, becoming an expensive tombstone. "Eagle 427, this is NORAD Command." A new voice cut through the radio traffic, hard and commanding. This wasn't Major Dawson anymore. This was a general, someone with stars on their shoulders and the authority to make decisions that could change the course of history. "Captain Mitchell, authenticate the Broken Arrow claim immediately. We need verification before we mobilize response teams." Mitchell's jaw tightened. He understood the necessity. You didn't deploy nuclear incident response teams on the word of an unidentified pilot flying a stolen aircraft. But every second spent on authentication was a second Rodriguez didn't have. "Sir, authentication code has been verified as valid for Captain James Rodriguez, currently listed as KIA from Transport 279. He's provided specific details about the cargo manifest that weren't in any public reports." "Not good enough, Captain." The general's voice was like iron. "Anyone with access to classified files could have that information. We need proof this isn't a sophisticated hoax or enemy operation. Put him on direct frequency with command. We'll ask questions only the real Rodriguez could answer." Mitchell switched channels. "Rodriguez, I'm patching you through to NORAD Command. They're going to ask you verification questions. Answer everything truthfully and quickly. We don't have time for mistakes." "Understood, sir." Rodriguez's voice was tight. "But sir, I need to tell you something first. The people who sabotaged us." "Captain Rodriguez, this is General Mackenzie, NORAD." The general's voice cut through like a knife. "We'll get to your conspiracy theories after you prove you are who you claim to be. Your mother's maiden name." Mitchell watched the Citation continue its descent. 19,000 feet. The Potomac was clearly visible now, a winding ribbon of water that marked the boundary between Maryland and Virginia. Beyond it, the monuments of Washington, D.C. rose like white sentinels against the blue sky. The Washington Monument, the Capitol Dome, the Lincoln Memorial, symbols of everything Rodriguez was supposedly trying to protect or potentially destroy. "Hernandez," Rodriguez answered. "Maria Hernandez. She was born in San Antonio, met my father at a church social in 1952. Your flight instructor at basic training." Major Kowalski. He failed me twice on instrument approaches before I finally got it right. Said I flew helicopters like I was driving a taxi through Manhattan. Mitchell could hear the general conferring with someone in the background, presumably checking Rodriguez's service records. Meanwhile, Chen was working her own channels, coordinating with air traffic control to clear civilian traffic from the area and identify potential landing sites. Her voice was calm, professional, but Mitchell could hear the undercurrent of tension. They both knew how this could end. The night before Transport 279's final flight, where were you? The general's questions continued relentlessly. At the Desert Rose Bar outside Nellie's, playing pool with Lieutenant Webb and Staff Sergeant Thompson. Rodriguez's voice cracked slightly on Thompson's name. Thompson was winning. He always won. He was buying rounds when we got the call that our departure time was moved up 6 hours. We left our drinks on the table and went straight to the flight line. And Thompson was dead, sir. Rodriguez's voice went flat, emotionless, the tone of someone who'd locked their grief in a box to deal with later. Died on impact when the nose hit the desert floor. I pulled him out of the wreckage, but he was already gone. So was Captain Morrison and Staff Sergeant Chen. I was in the tail section when we went down. That's the only reason I'm talking to you now instead of being scraped up for dental identification. The silence that followed stretched for 3 heartbeats. Mitchell could almost hear the general processing this, weighing the emotions in Rodriguez's voice against the possibility of deception. But Mitchell had heard real grief before, had lost wingmen and friends, and what he heard in Rodriguez's voice was authentic. "General, we're running out of altitude," Mitchell interjected. "Whatever you're going to decide, decide it now. This aircraft is at 17,000 feet and descending. If we don't start planning an emergency landing in the next 60 seconds, your only option is going to be identifying another body." "Stand by, Eagle 427. More background conversation, urgent and heated. Mitchell could imagine the scene in the NORAD command center, generals and intelligence officers arguing about protocols and procedures, while a clock ticked down toward catastrophe. The citation dropped through 16,000 feet. Mitchell checked his own fuel. He had enough to stay with Rodriguez all the way down to guide him in or, if it came to it, to watch him crash. But not both. If this went on much longer, he'd have to make a choice between shepherding a potential threat and ensuring his own survival. "Rodriguez," Mitchell said quietly, switching to a private channel, "talk to me about the sabotage. What exactly did you see?" There was a pause, filled with the whisper of wind over dead engines. When Rodriguez spoke again, his voice was low, urgent, as if he was afraid of being overheard even at 15,000 feet. "The hydraulic lines on the primary and backup systems. They weren't torn or broken, Captain. They were cut. Clean, precise cuts like someone used a razor or a very sharp knife. And they were cut in places where they wouldn't fail immediately, where the fluid would leak slowly during flight until we lost all pressure at once. That could have been damage from the crash," Mitchell suggested, playing devil's advocate even though his gut told him Rodriguez was telling the truth. "The cuts were on the upper side of the line, sir, away from the impact damage. I worked on helicopters for 3 years before I moved to fixed wing. I know what crash damage looks like versus intentional sabotage." Rodriguez's breathing was getting heavier again, exhaustion or pain, Mitchell couldn't tell. "And that's not the worst part. When I was hiking out of the desert trying to find help, I saw dust trails. Multiple vehicles, moving in a search pattern toward the crash site. This was on the 2nd day, before any official rescue operation had been launched." Chen's voice cut into Mitchell's thoughts. "Bob, I'm picking up encrypted radio traffic from the Nevada crash site coordinates. Multiple frequencies, military-grade encryption. Someone's already there." Mitchell felt ice crystallize in his veins. If Rodriguez was telling the truth, then somewhere in the Nevada desert, Lieutenant Marcus Webb was sitting on top of classified nuclear weapons technology, injured and alone, while unknown hostiles closed in. and the only person who could provide the exact location and situation assessment was currently flying a dead aircraft with 3 minutes of glide time left. "General Mackenzie, this is Mitchell," he transmitted, his voice carrying the full weight of command authority. "I'm making a tactical decision. I believe Captain Rodriguez is authentic. I'm going to guide him down to Bowling Air Force Base. You can send all the security teams you want to meet us on the ground, but we're landing this aircraft now, or we're going to have a civilian aircraft crash in suburban Maryland, and no intelligence about a potential Broken Arrow situation." The silence lasted 2 seconds. 2 seconds during which Mitchell watched the Citation descend through 14,000 feet, its glide ratio deteriorating as airspeed decayed. 2 seconds during which he committed himself to a course of action that could save lives or cost him his career. "Approved," General Mackenzie finally said. "But Captain Mitchell, if you're wrong about this, if Rodriguez is hostile or this is an elaborate deception, you'll spend the rest of your life wishing you'd shot that aircraft down when you had the chance." "Understood, sir." Mitchell switched back to Rodriguez's frequency. "All right, Captain, let's get you on the ground. You're going to do exactly what I say exactly when I say it. Copy." "Copy that, sir." Despite the desperate situation, Rodriguez's voice carried a note of relief. "And Captain Mitchell, thank you for believing me." Mitchell didn't respond. Belief didn't enter into it. He was making a calculated bet based on instinct, experience, and the read he got from a young pilot's voice. Whether that bet paid off or destroyed everything would be determined in the next 10 minutes. "Chen, give me vectors to Bowling, and patch me through to their tower. Tell them we've got an emergency inbound and to clear everything off that runway." "Already done," Chen replied. "Bob, Bowling is at our 10 o'clock, 15 miles, but we're at 13,000 feet and descending at 700 feet per minute. The math is going to be tight." Mitchell knew she was being diplomatic. The math wasn't tight, it was impossible. A Citation needed roughly a 3:1 glide ratio to reach a runway from this altitude and distance. They had maybe 2:1 if Rodriguez flew perfectly, which he wouldn't because he barely knew how to fly the aircraft at all. They were going to come up short. The only question was by how much, and what they'd hit when they did. The mathematics of death were simple and unforgiving. Mitchell ran the calculations in his head as he guided his F-15 into position slightly ahead and above the gliding Citation. 13,000 feet of altitude, 15 miles to Bowling Air Force Base. A descent rate that was increasing as the Citation's airspeed bled off. The numbers didn't lie, and they spelled disaster. "Rodriguez, I need you to hold your airspeed at exactly 140 knots, Mitchell instructed, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "Not 145, not 135. Exactly 140. That's your best glide speed. Watch the airspeed indicator. It's the gauge at the top center of your panel with the needle and the colored arcs." "I see it," Rodriguez responded, his voice tight with concentration. "It's at 132 right now, dropping." "Then push the nose down slightly. Don't be afraid to lose altitude faster. We need that speed to maintain lift. Remember, the enemy is the stall, not the ground. The ground will only kill you once. A stall will kill you and everyone below you." Mitchell watched the Citation's nose dip fractionally. Too much. The airspeed began climbing past 140. Back pressure on the yoke, gentle, like you're trying not to wake someone sleeping on the control column. The Citation's nose came up, overcorrected, dropped again. Rodriguez was learning to fly by trial and error at 12,000 feet with no engine and no second chances. It was like watching someone try to defuse a bomb using instructions shouted from across the room. Every correction was exaggerated, every adjustment a potential catastrophe. Chen's voice was clinical in Mitchell's ear, reporting data with the detachment of someone who trained herself not to feel while lives hung in the balance. 11,000 feet. Glide ratio is 2.2 to 1. Bowling runway is 12 miles at our current position. Bob, even if he flies perfectly from here, he's going to be 2,000 feet short of the threshold. 2,000 feet short meant hitting suburbs, houses, schools. It was 9:47 a.m. on a Thursday. People were home, children were in classrooms, morning commuters were stuck in traffic. A citation coming down in a residential area would carve a path of destruction through lives that had no idea they were in danger. "Command, we need alternatives," Mitchell transmitted. "Rodriguez cannot make bowling. Where's the nearest open space?" Major Dawson's voice came back immediately. He'd clearly been anticipating this. "Anacostia Park, directly north of Bowling. It's a flood plain along the river. Mostly open grass and softball fields. If he can make it that far, he's got maybe 800 yards of open ground." Mitchell pulled up the terrain map on his navigation display. Anacostia Park was a green rectangle along the Potomac, a recreational area that would be relatively empty on a Thursday morning in October. Better than houses, but still far from ideal. The park was bordered by busy roads, had scattered trees, and somewhere in his memory, Mitchell recalled there were tennis courts and a public pool. "Rodriguez, change of plans," Mitchell said, keeping his voice calm and authoritative. "We're not going for the runway. There's a park 1 mile north of the airfield. Open grass. I'm going to guide you to it." A pause, then, "A park, sir. I don't know if I can hit something that small." "You don't have to hit it. You just have to not hit everything else." Mitchell banked his F-15, positioning himself to give Rodriguez a visual reference. "See my aircraft at your 11 o'clock. I'm going to fly straight toward your landing zone. Follow my path. When I break left, you'll be lined up." "Copy that." Rodriguez's voice wavered, then steadied. "Following you in." They descended through 10,000 feet. The landscape below was transforming from abstract geography into concrete reality. Mitchell could see individual buildings now, cars on highways, the white dome of the Capitol building gleaming in the morning sun. Somewhere down there, people were drinking coffee, checking emails, arguing about politics, completely unaware that a drama involving nuclear weapons and sabotage was playing out in the sky above them. "Talk to me about Webb," Mitchell said, partly to get information, partly to keep Rodriguez focused on something other than his impending crash. "What's his exact situation?" Rodriguez's breathing had become labored again. Exhaustion, fear, or pain, Mitchell couldn't tell. "When I left him 36 hours ago, he had a compound fracture of the right tibia, probably some internal injuries, severe dehydration. We'd managed to drag the broken aero package into a natural depression in the rocks, covered it with debris from the aircraft. He had his sidearm, 2 magazines, and a field first aid kit." "How many hostiles did you see approaching?" 3 vehicles. Looked like civilian SUVs, but they were moving in a tactical search pattern, not random. They knew approximately where we went down." Rodriguez paused, fighting with the controls as the citation encountered some turbulence. "Webb and we talked about it before I left. We think someone on the ground was tracking us, guiding whoever sabotaged the aircraft. They knew we'd crash, but they didn't know exactly where. When the official search found us faster than expected, they probably panicked." Chen cut in. "Bob, I've got an update from Nevada. A special operations team just reached the crash coordinates. They're reporting—" Her voice trailed off. "Jesus. They're reporting an active firefight, small arms fire. Webb is engaged with multiple hostiles." Mitchell felt his hands tighten on the controls. While they'd been dealing with Rodriguez's authentication and emergency landing, Lieutenant Marcus Webb had been fighting for his life in the desert. The young officer was wounded, outnumbered, protecting classified nuclear technology from what sounded like a well-organized team of saboteurs. "Is the special ops team engaging?" Mitchell demanded. "Affirmative, but Bob, Webb is badly injured. They're calling for immediate medevac." Chen's voice dropped. "This is real. Rodriguez was telling the truth about all of it." The validation felt hollow. Mitchell had already committed to believing Rodriguez. The confirmation just meant the stakes were even higher than he'd thought. Somewhere in Nevada, Americans were shooting at Americans over stolen nuclear technology, and the only witness who could identify the saboteurs was currently flying a dead aircraft toward an increasingly unlikely survival scenario. 8,000 feet, Chen reported. Airspeed 138 knots. Descent rate 650 feet per minute. Distance to park 4 miles. Mitchell did the math again. It was going to be close. Painfully, impossibly close. Rodriguez, I need you to do something difficult, Mitchell said. I need you to stay calm when I tell you this. You're going to hit short of the park. Not by much, but short. There's a 4-lane road on the south side. If we're lucky, you'll skip across it and slide into the grass. And if we're not lucky, Rodriguez's voice was surprisingly steady. Then you'll hit cars, light poles, or trees, and this conversation ends badly. Mitchell kept his tone matter of fact. Sugarcoating wouldn't help. Rodriguez needed to know what he was facing. But here's the thing. You've survived a sabotaged aircraft crash, hiked 40 miles through the desert with broken ribs, and flew a plane you barely know how to start across half the country. Luck seems to be on your side today. A sound came through the radio that might have been a laugh or a sob. Luck and desperation, sir. Don't forget desperation. They passed through 6,000 feet. Mitchell could see Anacostia Park now, a rectangle of green bordered by roads and the darker blue of the Potomac River. Beyond it, Bolling Air Force Base with its runways and hangars, so close, yet impossibly far. Emergency vehicles were already positioning themselves, red and blue lights flashing soundlessly in the distance. All right, Rodriguez, this is it, Mitchell said, beginning his braking maneuver. When I bank left, count to 3 and start your turn. Aim for the center of the park. Whatever you do, don't try to flare too early. Let the aircraft settle, then at the last second, and I mean the very last second, pull back on the yoke to lift the nose. How will I know when it's the last second? Mitchell watched the citation, watched the ground rising to meet it, watched the young captain fighting controls in an aircraft that had become nothing more than an expensive glider. Trust me, son. You'll know. He banked hard left, breaking away from the citation's path. For a moment, his canopy was filled with nothing but blue sky and white clouds. Then he rolled level and looked back. The citation was lined up perfectly, dropping toward Anacostia Park like a white arrow fired from heaven. Rodriguez had maybe 30 seconds before impact. 30 seconds to prove whether Mitchell's faith in him had been justified or whether that faith would end in a fireball that would haunt Mitchell's dreams for the rest of his life. The ground rushed up. The citation dropped below the tree line, disappearing from Mitchell's view. And Captain Robert Mitchell held his breath, waiting for the sound of impact. The citation disappeared below the tree line, and for 3 eternal seconds, Mitchell heard nothing but the roar of his own engines and the hammer of his heartbeat in his ears. He banked hard, pulling his F-15 around in a tight circle to get visual on the impact zone, his altimeter unwinding as he descended. 4,000 feet, 3,500, 3,000, pushing the limits of safety in controlled airspace because he needed to see, needed to know. Then the sound reached him even through his helmet and the insulated cockpit, a metallic shriek that seemed to tear the air itself, the unmistakable scream of aluminum scraping across asphalt at 140 knots. Mitchell's stomach clenched. "I've got visual," Chen shouted. He's down, south edge of the park." He clipped the road. Mitchell saw it then, a scene that would burn itself into his memory with perfect clarity. The citation had indeed hit short, its landing gear striking the 4-lane road bordering Anacostia Park. But instead of cartwheeling into a catastrophic fireball, the aircraft had done something almost miraculous. The right main gear had caught the curb, snapping off instantly and sending the aircraft into a violent ground loop. The left gear collapsed a heartbeat later, and the citation's belly hit the asphalt in an explosion of sparks that looked like a welder's torch dragged across the pavement. The aircraft skipped, actually bounced off the road like a stone across water, sailed over the sidewalk, and slammed into the grass of the park with an impact Mitchell felt in his bones even from 2,000 feet above. The Citation's momentum carried it forward, carving a trench through the softball field, spraying dirt and grass in a rooster tail behind it. "He's still moving," Mitchell transmitted, unable to keep the urgency from his voice. "Emergency crews, be advised, aircraft is sliding through the park, trajectory northeast toward the tennis courts." The Citation hit a small drainage ditch that Mitchell hadn't seen on the maps, and the aircraft's nose dipped violently. For a terrible moment, Mitchell thought it would flip, tumbling end over end in a destruction that would crush anyone inside. But the nose came back up, slamming down hard, and the aircraft continued its slide, rotating slowly counterclockwise like a spinning top winding down. 70 yards, 80, 90, 100 yards of scored earth marking the Citation's path of destruction. Mitchell saw a child's bicycle abandoned near the softball diamond, saw a dog running in panic circles, saw a maintenance worker diving behind an equipment shed as the white aircraft screamed past. And then, with the tennis courts less than 50 feet away, the Citation stopped. For one frozen moment, nothing moved. The aircraft sat motionless in the middle of Anacostia Park, its white fuselage now stained brown with dirt, both engines torn completely off, the landing gear scattered across hundreds of yards, the elegant T-tail bent at an unnatural angle. Smoke poured from the wheel wells where the brake assemblies had ground themselves to nothing. But there was no fire. Not yet. "Rodriguez," Mitchell shouted into the radio. "Rodriguez, respond." Static, just the hiss of an open channel and the distant wail of sirens. Mitchell descended to 1,500 feet, circling the crash site in a tight orbit. Emergency vehicles were already converging from 3 directions: fire trucks, ambulances, military police from Bowling Air Force Base. But they were still 45 seconds away, and if there was fuel leaking, if there was any kind of electrical short, those seconds could be the difference between rescue and cremation. "Come on, kid," Mitchell muttered, his eyes locked on the crumpled Citation. "You survived the desert. You flew a plane you barely knew how to start. Don't die now. Don't you dare die now." Movement. A flicker of motion near the cockpit. The emergency exit door, mounted on the left side of the fuselage, just behind the wing, suddenly popped open, falling away to reveal a dark rectangle. For a moment, nothing. Then a figure appeared in the opening, moving with the jerky, uncoordinated motions of someone fighting through pain and shock. "I've got survivor movement," Chen reported, her voice tight with relief. "One person visible in the port exit." Mitchell watched as Captain James Rodriguez dragged himself through the emergency exit and half fell, half jumped to the ground. The young captain landed badly, his legs giving out, and he collapsed to his hands and knees in the torn grass. But he was moving. He was alive. Rodriguez tried to stand, failed, tried again. This time he made it to his feet, swaying like a drunk, one hand pressed against his ribs. Even from 1,500 feet, Mitchell could see the dark stains on Rodriguez's flight suit. Blood, new and old, from injuries sustained in the original crash and compounded by the desperate cross-country flight. But Rodriguez wasn't running away from the aircraft. He was going back toward it. "What the hell is he doing?" Chen muttered. Mitchell watched in disbelief as Rodriguez stumbled back to the Citation's cabin door, reaching inside. He was trying to pull something, or someone out. The unconscious pilot. The ranch owner's aircraft might be destroyed, but Rodriguez was still trying to save the man who'd been flying it before his heart attack or stroke, or whatever medical emergency had incapacitated him mid-flight. "Negative, negative," Mitchell transmitted, though he knew Rodriguez couldn't hear him with the aircraft's radios dead. "Get away from the aircraft. Emergency crews are 10 seconds out." As if to punctuate his words, a small fire erupted near the Citation's right wing root, fuel that had leaked from ruptured lines finally finding an ignition source. Orange flames licked up the side of the fuselage, and black smoke began to pour from the cabin. Rodriguez saw it. He had to have seen it. But he didn't let go of the unconscious pilot. Instead, he braced his feet, wrapped both arms around the man's chest, and pulled with everything he had left. The pilot came free of the cockpit in a rush, and both men tumbled backward onto the grass. Rodriguez rolled away, trying to drag the unconscious man with him, but his strength was finally giving out. He made it perhaps 10 feet before his legs folded completely, and he collapsed again, this time staying down. The fire was spreading faster now, crawling across the wing toward the fuel tanks that Mitchell knew held at least fumes, if not actual liquid fuel. If those tanks went up. The first fire truck arrived in a spray of gravel and squealing brakes. Foam cannons deployed instantly, white chemical suppressant arcing through the air to blanket the burning aircraft. More trucks arrived, more foam, more emergency personnel in bulky protective gear running toward the wreckage. 2 paramedics reached Rodriguez first. Mitchell watched them drop beside the young captain, checking vitals, starting emergency treatment. Another team reached the unconscious pilot, immediately beginning CPR. The scene below was controlled chaos, organized, professional, but with an undercurrent of desperate urgency. Mitchell pulled his F-15 up and away, giving the emergency crews room to work. His fuel was getting low, and he needed to land soon. But he kept one eye on the park, on the small figure being loaded onto a stretcher, on the aircraft that was now completely engulfed in foam but still burning stubbornly beneath the white blanket. Eagle 427, this is Bowling Tower, a voice crackled in his helmet. You're cleared for immediate landing, runway 21, and Captain Mitchell, General Mackenzie wants to speak with you the moment your wheels touch down. Copy that, Bowling. Mitchell lined up his approach, but his mind was still in Anacostia Park, still replaying those final seconds. Chen, what's the status on Nevada? Special Operations Team has secured the crash site and extracted Lieutenant Webb, she reported. He's badly wounded but stable. The hostiles, Bob, there were 5 of them, all dead. Webb held them off for almost an hour before backup arrived. 5 hostiles, dead. And Rodriguez had been right about all of it, the sabotage, the conspiracy, the threat to the Broken Arrow package. Which meant the young captain lying on a stretcher in Anacostia Park wasn't just a survivor. He was a witness. The only person who could identify who had sabotaged Transport 279, who had tried to steal classified nuclear weapons technology, and who had been willing to kill 4 Air Force crew members to do it. Mitchell's landing gear touched down with barely a jolt, his hands working the controls with automatic precision honed over thousands of hours. But his mind was racing ahead, connecting dots, seeing implications. Rodriguez had said the saboteurs were ours, Americans. That meant this wasn't a foreign operation. This was treason, and traitors didn't leave witnesses alive if they could help it. Chen, get me a secure line to base security, Mitchell said as he taxied toward the hangar where military police vehicles were already waiting. Rodriguez needs a protective detail. Now. Already being arranged, Chen replied. Bob, they're also asking about the notebook, the one Rodriguez was carrying when they pulled him from the wreckage. Mitchell had forgotten about that, the small notebook Rodriguez had clutched even while unconscious, filled with coordinates and codes and evidence. What about it? Intelligence officers are en route to collect it. Whatever's in those pages, it's being treated as the highest classification level possible. Chen paused. Bob, I think we just stumbled into something a lot bigger than a crashed transport flight. Mitchell brought his F-15 to a stop and began the shutdown sequence, his hands moving through the familiar checklist while his mind grappled with unfamiliar territory. He was a fighter pilot, not an intelligence officer. He interdicted threats. He defended airspace. He shot down enemy aircraft when necessary. He didn't uncover conspiracies or expose traitors. But somehow, in the span of 30 minutes, he'd done exactly that. and he had a feeling the real nightmare was just beginning. The debriefing room at Andrews Air Force Base was deliberately intimidating, windowless, soundproofed, with walls the color of old concrete and furniture that looked like it had survived several Cold War presidencies. Mitchell sat in a metal chair that was slightly too low, facing a table where General Thomas Mackenzie loomed like a monument to military authority. The general was 63, silver-haired, with a chest full of ribbons that told the story of Vietnam, Grenada, and a dozen classified operations that would never make it into history books. Beside him sat two people Mitchell didn't recognize. A woman in her 40s wearing a conservative dark suit and an expression that screamed CIA, and a younger man in Air Force intelligence uniform whose fingers never stopped moving, taking notes on a classified tablet. "Captain Mitchell," General Mackenzie began, his voice carrying the weight of 35 years of command. "In the last hour, you've committed an F-15 worth $65 million to escort an unidentified aircraft into restricted airspace. You've overruled direct orders to force that aircraft down, and you've authorized an emergency landing in a public park that could have killed civilians. You want to explain to me why I shouldn't court-martial you right now?" Mitchell met the general's eyes steadily. "Because I was right, sir." The general's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the woman in the suit spoke up. Her voice was cultured, educated, and carried the kind of authority that didn't need volume to command attention. "I'm Deputy Director Sarah Vance, Defense Intelligence Agency. Captain Mitchell, everything that happens in this room is classified at the TS-SCI level. You will not discuss it with anyone, including your family, your priest, or your therapist. Are we clear?" "Crystal clear, ma'am." Vance opened a folder and slid a photograph across the table. It showed a page from Rodriguez's notebook, cramped handwriting, coordinates, numbers, and what looked like surveillance photos taped to the margins. "Captain Rodriguez was carrying this when he crashed. We've had cryptographers working on it for the last 45 minutes. What he documented." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "What he documented is evidence of a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of defense contracting, and possibly into the Pentagon itself." Mitchell leaned forward, studying the photograph. The handwriting was nearly illegible in places, written by someone exhausted, injured, and fighting against time. But certain phrases jumped out. "Hydraulic sabotage confirmed. Surveillance team, 3 vehicles, civilian plates. Package location compromised before departure, and most damning, Morrison received encrypted call 30 minutes before takeoff, seemed agitated." "Captain Morrison was the pilot of Transport 279, Mitchell asked. "Correct," the intelligence officer said, speaking for the first time. His name tag read Major Chen, no relation to Mitchell's WSO. "Captain David Morrison, 15-year veteran, exemplary record, 2 commendations for valor. Also, as of 6 hours ago, confirmed to have received a deposit of $250,000 into an offshore account 3 days before the flight." The number hung in the air like poison gas. Mitchell felt his stomach turn. He was in on it. The pilot was part of the sabotage. "We believe Morrison was recruited to provide flight plans and cargo manifests to unknown parties," Vance continued. "But here's where it gets complicated. The autopsy on Morrison's body," she paused, pulling out another photograph, this one from the crash site, mercifully showing only Morrison's flight suit and not his remains, showed a bullet wound. Small caliber, entry through the back of the skull. Rodriguez's notebook mentions hearing a gunshot just before the hydraulics failed. Mitchell's mind raced through the implications. They killed him. Morrison was their inside man, but they killed him anyway to eliminate the witness. "Exactly." General Mackenzie's voice was grim. "We're dealing with professionals here. They plan to crash the aircraft, steal the broken aero package from the wreckage, and leave no survivors to identify them. They didn't count on Rodriguez and Webb surviving, and they especially didn't count on Rodriguez being smart enough to document everything." The general slid another document across the table, This one, a medical report. Lieutenant Webb's testimony corroborates Rodriguez's account. He saw the saboteurs approaching the crash site, counted 5 individuals, heard them communicating via radio with at least 2 other parties. He engaged them to protect the package and to buy time for Rodriguez to get help. 5 hostiles, the intelligence officer added, his voice clinical. All former military, 2 Army Rangers, 1 Marine Force Recon, 2 Navy SEALs, all supposedly retired, all working for a private military contractor called Artemis Global Solutions. Mitchell had heard of Artemis, everyone in the military had. They provided security services, training, logistics support to the Department of Defense. They had contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. You're telling me a defense contractor tried to steal nuclear weapons technology? Not just tried, Captain, Vance corrected. They had a buyer. We've intercepted communications suggesting the Broken Arrow package was promised to a foreign power. We're still determining which one, for an estimated $50 million. Morrison's $250,000 was just his down payment. The scope of it was staggering. This wasn't just theft. This wasn't even just treason. This was a conspiracy that could have compromised American nuclear capabilities, that could have shifted the balance of power in the Cold War, that could have gotten millions of people killed. Where's Rodriguez now? Mitchell asked. Walter Reed Medical Center under armed guard, General Mackenzie replied. Broken ribs, severe dehydration, second-degree burns from the crash landing, and a concussion that should have put him in a coma. The doctors can't understand how he stayed conscious long enough to fly that citation, much less land it without killing himself. Adrenaline, Mitchell said simply, and stubbornness. I talked to him for 30 minutes, General. That kid wasn't going to die until he completed his mission. Vance closed her folder and leaned back, studying Mitchell with eyes that had probably seen every kind of human behavior imaginable. Captain Mitchell, you're being reassigned effective immediately. You'll be working with DIA to identify everyone involved in this conspiracy. Your conversation with Rodriguez, your observations during the intercept. You may have noticed details that didn't seem important at the time but could be crucial now. I'm a fighter pilot, ma'am, not an investigator. You're whatever we need you to be, Captain, General Mackenzie said flatly. This is a matter of national security. We have a defense contractor attempting to steal nuclear weapons. We have murdered Air Force personnel. We have traitors who are still out there, who know that Rodriguez and Webb survived, and who will do anything to prevent their testimony from reaching a courtroom. The implication was clear. Rodriguez and Webb were targets, and anyone associated with them might be too. What about the ranch owner? Mitchell asked suddenly. Bill Henderson, the man who lent Rodriguez his aircraft, is he safe? Vance and the general exchanged a glance. We have agents en route to his location now, Vance said carefully. But Captain, Henderson's ranch is in a very remote area of Nevada. We've been unable to reach him by phone for the last 3 hours. Ice crystallized in Mitchell's veins. Henderson was 78 years old, a Korean War veteran living alone in the desert. If Artemis Global Solutions had realized, Rodriguez had gotten help from a local. You need to get to him now, Mitchell said urgently. If Rodriguez told me about Henderson, he might have mentioned him in his initial radio transmissions, if anyone was monitoring military frequencies. We're aware of the risk, Vance cut him off, but her expression confirmed his fears. They were too late, they knew it and Mitchell knew it. The door to the debriefing room opened and a young lieutenant entered, his face pale. He handed a slip of paper to General Mackenzie, who read it and closed his eyes briefly, a gesture of grief quickly suppressed. Bill Henderson was found dead in his home 40 minutes ago, the general said quietly. Single gunshot wound to the head made to look like suicide. His Korean War medals were arranged on the kitchen table next to him. His voice hardened. Artemis is cleaning up loose ends. They're professionals, they're connected, and they're desperate. Mitchell felt rage building in his chest, hot, righteous fury at the murder of an old veteran who'd only wanted to help a young officer in trouble. Henderson had handed over his personal aircraft, had probably given Rodriguez food and water, had believed in him when he had every reason to think the story was crazy. And he'd been executed for it. "What do you need from me?" Mitchell asked, his voice steady but edged with steel. General Mackenzie stood and the others followed suit. "Rodriguez's notebook contains names, dates, and surveillance photos. We need you to help us identify everyone involved. Then we need you to testify at the courts-martial and congressional hearings that are going to tear through the Pentagon like a hurricane." He paused, his eyes hard. "And Captain, we need you to help us make sure Captain Rodriguez and Lieutenant Webb live long enough to see justice done." Mitchell stood as well, coming to attention. "Sir, when can I see Rodriguez?" "Tomorrow morning, 800 hours. We're keeping him sedated for now. His body needs rest more than we need his testimony." The general moved toward the door, then paused. "Mitchell, you made a call today that saved lives and potentially prevented a catastrophic breach of national security. But you also put yourself in the crosshairs of people who have already killed at least 6 Americans that we know of. You understand what that means." Mitchell thought of Rodriguez dragging himself through the desert, flying a plane he barely knew how to start, crash landing in a park, and still having the presence of mind to save the unconscious pilot. He thought of Webb holding off 5 armed professionals with a sidearm and a broken leg. He thought of Bill Henderson, dead in his kitchen with his medals arranged like a memorial. "I understand perfectly, sir," Mitchell said. "When do we start hunting these bastards?" General Mackenzie's grim expression shifted into something that might have been approval. "We already have. And Captain, welcome to the war you didn't know you were fighting." 3 months later, Captain Robert Mitchell stood in the gallery of a closed military tribunal, watching as the final pieces of the Artemis conspiracy fell into place. The courtroom was filled with military brass, intelligence officers, and attorneys whose security clearances were so high they barely existed on paper. At the prosecution table sat 2 men in flight suits, both wearing medals that had been pinned on them just weeks earlier. Captain James Rodriguez had lost 23 pounds during his ordeal and walked with a slight limp that doctors said might never fully heal. His broken ribs had punctured a lung during the crash landing. He'd been flying with a collapsed lung and hadn't even known it. The burns on his hands from the hot controls had required skin grafts. But his dark eyes were clear and fierce as he testified about hydraulic lines cut with surgical precision, about Morrison's encrypted phone call, about the 5 days he and Webb had fought to survive while protecting secrets that could reshape the world. Beside him sat Lieutenant Marcus Webb, his right leg ending in a prosthetic that the VA had assured him was state-of-the-art. Webb had held off 5 trained killers for 53 minutes with 17 bullets and pure determination. When the special operations team had reached him, he'd been unconscious from blood loss, his hand still gripped around his sidearm, his body positioned between the hostiles and the broken aero package he'd sworn to protect. The tribunal had been running for 6 weeks, peeling back layers of conspiracy that reached further than anyone had imagined. Artemis Global Solutions had been selling American military secrets to the highest bidder for at least 3 years. The broken aero package from Transport 279, advanced guidance systems that could make any ballistic missile 20 times more accurate, was supposed to be their crowning achievement, worth enough money to set up their leadership for life. Instead, it had become their downfall. 12 Artemis executives and contractors were already in military prison awaiting sentencing. Captain David Morrison's widow had returned the offshore blood money and was cooperating with investigators, claiming, probably truthfully, that she'd known nothing about her husband's treason. The Pentagon had launched an internal investigation that had already led to the forced retirement of 2 generals and the arrest of a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. But the price had been steep. 6 Air Force personnel dead, Morrison, Thompson, the 2 other crew members from Transport 279, Bill Henderson, and a DIA analyst who discovered part of the conspiracy and been mugged in Washington, D.C. before she could report it. Good people, dead because they'd either known too much or helped those who did. Mitchell's testimony had taken 2 full days. He'd recounted every word of his conversation with Rodriguez, every observation from the intercept, every instinct that had told him the young captain was telling the truth. Defense attorneys had tried to shake him, suggesting he'd been reckless, that he'd endangered civilians, that he'd violated protocol. General Mackenzie had shut that down with a single sentence. Captain Mitchell prevented a nuclear weapons theft and exposed a conspiracy that threatened national security. His recklessness saved American lives and American secrets. Next question. Now, as the tribunal prepared to deliver its final verdict on the 3 remaining Artemis executives, Mitchell watched Rodriguez and Webb sit side by side, brothers forged in fire and desert sand and impossible odds. They'd become minor legends in the Air Force, the 2 officers who'd refused to die, who turned a catastrophic sabotage into a devastating counterattack against traitors. The Judge Advocate General, a stern woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, read the verdict. On all counts of conspiracy to commit treason, theft of classified materials, and murder of United States military personnel. Guilty. The courtroom remained silent. This was military justice, not theater. The defendants would spend the rest of their lives in federal prison, their names erased from the companies they'd built, their fortunes seized under asset forfeiture laws. It wasn't enough to bring back the dead, but it was something. After the tribunal adjourned, Mitchell found Rodriguez and Webb outside, standing in the cold November air and looking up at a sky filled with heavy gray clouds. Rodriguez saw him approaching and smiled. A real smile, the first Mitchell had seen on the young captain's face in 3 months. "Captain Mitchell," Rodriguez said, extending his hand, "I never properly thanked you for believing me when no one else would." Mitchell shook his hand, feeling the ridge of scar tissue from the skin grafts. "You didn't give me much choice. That call sign, Ghost Rider, it stopped my heart for about 5 seconds. "That was the point," Webb interjected, his voice carrying a dry humor that suggested he was healing in more than just physical ways. "Rodriguez and we knew that if we just said help, we crashed. We'd be ignored or dismissed. But Ghost Rider, that was supposed to make someone pay attention long enough to listen." "It worked," Mitchell said simply. Then, after a pause, "What's next for you two?" Rodriguez and Webb exchanged glances. "Medical retirement," Rodriguez said. "I'll never pass a flight physical again, not with my lung capacity. But," he pulled a letter from his jacket pocket, "the DIA offered me a position, intelligence analysis. Seems they think someone who can survive what I survived might have useful insights into how conspiracies work." "And you?" Mitchell turned to Webb. The lieutenant shrugged. "Training command, teaching young officers about security protocols and what to do when everything goes wrong. Figure I've got some relevant experience." His expression darkened briefly. "And making sure people remember the ones who didn't make it. Thompson, Morrison, even though he betrayed us, he was still manipulated by people who didn't care who died as long as they got paid. Henderson, who gave us everything and asked for nothing." Mitchell nodded slowly. The memorial service for Transport 279's crew had been held at Arlington 6 weeks ago. Rodriguez and Webb had both spoken, their words brief but devastating in their honesty. Mitchell had stood in the back, watching grieving families try to process not just death but betrayal, and he'd felt the weight of every decision he'd made that October morning. "You ever wonder what would have happened if I'd shot you down?" Mitchell asked Rodriguez quietly. The young captain met his eyes steadily. "Every single day, sir, and every day I'm grateful you trusted your gut instead of your orders." A cold wind swept through the parking lot, carrying the smell of approaching snow. Mitchell pulled his uniform jacket tighter and thought about the random chances that had led to this moment. If Rodriguez had crashed in a slightly different location, if he'd been too injured to walk, if he'd found someone less willing to help than Bill Henderson, if Mitchell had been a different kind of pilot, less willing to question, more willing to shoot first and ask questions later. "You know what the hardest part is," Rodriguez said suddenly, his voice distant. "Knowing that we almost didn't make it, that we were maybe 30 seconds from you firing on us, or my fuel running out 10 miles short, or Webb bleeding out before the special ops team arrived. We lived because of 100 tiny miracles, and every single one of them had to happen exactly right." "That's not miracles," Webb said firmly. "That's you flying a plane you barely knew how to start across half the country on nothing but willpower. That's me holding off 5 hostiles with 17 rounds because I refused to let them win. That's Captain Mitchell here risking his career to give us a chance. Miracles are random. What we did was survive through pure stubborn determination." Mitchell found himself smiling despite the somber conversation. "Your determination almost gave me a heart attack when you went back into that burning citation to save the pilot." "Mr. Henderson loaned me his plane," Rodriguez said simply, as if that explained everything. "The least I could do was try to save the guy flying it when he had his heart attack. Turns out he made it, by the way, full recovery. Sent me a letter saying I could borrow his plane anytime." He laughed softly. "I didn't have the heart to tell him there's nothing left to borrow." They stood together in silence for a moment, 3 men bound by 30 minutes of crisis that had exposed a conspiracy and changed lives forever. In the distance, an F-15 took off from Andrews, its engines roaring defiance at gravity. Mitchell watched it climb, remembering the feeling of power and purpose that came from flying those magnificent machines. "I've been recommended for promotion," Mitchell said after a while. "Major, they're assigning me to a Pentagon liaison position, coordinating between tactical air operations and intelligence services." He grimaced. "Desk job. I'm going to hate every minute of it." "But you'll take it," Rodriguez said. "It wasn't a question." "But I'll take it," Mitchell confirmed. "Because after what I've seen, I understand that the war isn't just in the sky anymore. It's in the shadows, in the encrypted communications, in the defense contractors who put profit over patriotism. Someone needs to watch for the next conspiracy, the next betrayal. Might as well be someone who knows what it looks like." Webb checked his watch. "We need to get going. They're dedicating a memorial plaque at Henderson's ranch tomorrow. Rodriguez and I are flying out tonight." "Flying commercial or military?" Mitchell asked. Rodriguez's smile turned wicked. "Commercial. I've had enough of military aircraft for a while. Besides, I hear the peanuts are better." They shook hands one final time, and Mitchell watched them walk toward a waiting car. 2 young officers who'd stared down death and conspiracy, and had emerged as something more than they'd been before. He thought about the moment Rodriguez's call sign had frozen his cockpit, the impossible words "Ghost Rider is still alive" crackling through his headset. In that moment Mitchell had made a choice: believe or destroy, trust or eliminate, give mercy or deliver justice. He'd chosen to believe, and that choice had saved lives, exposed traitors, and prevented a catastrophic theft of American nuclear secrets. But it had also cost lives. Henderson, the DIA analyst, the crew of Transport 279 who'd been murdered by people they'd trusted. Captain Robert Mitchell climbed into his own car and sat behind the wheel, not starting the engine, just thinking. Years later, long after he'd made general, long after Rodriguez had become one of DIA's most effective analysts and Webb had trained a generation of security-conscious officers, Mitchell would still remember this moment. The cold November air, the gray sky, the weight of choices made and lives changed. And he would remember that sometimes, the most dangerous thing a soldier can hear isn't enemy fire or missile lock warnings or engines failing. Sometimes the most dangerous thing is a call sign that shouldn't exist, a ghost calling from beyond death with a message that could destroy or save the world. Captain James Rodriguez had been that ghost, rising from the Nevada desert with truth and determination and stubborn refusal to let evil win. And Captain Robert Mitchell had been the man who'd listened when every instinct, every protocol, every rule said he should shoot first and ask questions later. In the end, Mitchell thought as he finally started his car, that's what separated the good officers from the great ones. The wisdom to know when the rules didn't account for ghosts, and the courage to believe in voices that called from the impossible dark. He pulled out of the parking lot and headed home, leaving behind the tribunal, the conspiracy, and the call sign that had frozen his cockpit and changed his life forever.